welcome to the Exploring Economic Freedom lecture series. Our speaker today is Dr. Virgil Henry Storr. He is a professor at the Department of Economics at George Mason University, where he's also a Don C. Lavoie Research Fellow. He is also a Senior Research Fellow and the Director of Graduate Student Programs at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is the author of 2 books, The Political Economy of Hurricane Katrina and Community Rebound, and also Enterprising Slaves and Master Pirates, and Understanding Economic Life in the Bahamas. Dr. Storr is the editor-in-chief of Studies in Emergent Order and a guest editor for a review of Austrian economics. Dr. Storr has published more than 30 journals, more than 30 articles in various journals, and has written chapters in several books. Here to talk with us today about the cultural and political economy of disaster recovery, specifically in New Orleans, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Virgil Henry Storr.
Hey, thank you guys for coming out. I want to thank Alex especially for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. He's been saying very good things about Metro State for a few years now, and so it's good to be able to see some of it for myself and to meet some of you guys. It's 5+ years after Katrina, community redevelopment recovery in New Orleans. So Hurricane Katrina hits the Gulf Coast of the United States August 29th. Category 5 hurricane when it lands, leaves destruction in its wake. It's not the worst thing that happens though. Following it, there's flooding in a city like New Orleans, which is much of it's below the sea level, which is the exact opposite problem, I guess, than the one you have here in Denver. But it hits, and what for the last 5 years, my colleague and I, Emily Chamley-Wright, have been doing is looking at how it is that the people in New Orleans responded to and recovered from that disaster. So what I want to do today is tell you some about that. Begin by just giving you a little roadmap of where I want to go today. First, I want to talk about the political economy of disaster and post-disaster recovery. Basically give you a sense of why a political economist would be interested in disaster in the first place. What's the puzzle to be solved? What kind of questions would an economist ask about something like recovery from a disaster that a sociologist or an anthropologist or a disaster studies person or an environmental studies person wouldn't ask. Then I want to give you some specifics about the Katrina disaster itself. Highlight some of the specific challenges related to recovering from Katrina. You know, the hurricane again, the flooding in a city that's 49% below sea level. And response to a disaster that's been described as the largest natural disaster in the U.S.'s history. And then I want to give you some of the answers that we came up to the questions about why it is that people actually return to there after such devastation, and how it is that they actually went about doing this. In the talk today, I'll highlight 4 basic things. These are things that came up again and again in our research, and so I want to talk about them here. This list, I should note, is not exhaustive. There's certainly other things that went into play in helping communities recover that mattered for disaster recovery there, but the things I want to highlight are specifically the role of club goods. Club goods are goods that are non-rivalrous in consumption. You would know this from your econ classes, meaning that they're goods where the consumption by one person doesn't inhibit or challenge the consumption of another. So you can think of like the view of the sky as being a good that's non-rivalrous in consumption. We all can look at it without you're looking at it, meaning that it's you looking at it taking away from my ability to appreciate it. But they're also goods that are excludable. And so they're goods where if you don't pay for it, you can be capped out. And so I'm going to talk about the role of club goods. In that case, you can think of something like cable TV, for instance. People who pay for cable TV can get it, but multiple people can pay for cable TV. It's not a big deal. My viewing of cable TV doesn't go down as a result of other people paying for cable TV. Then I want to talk about the role of sense of place. And sense of place is essentially the emotional, psychological, social connection that people have to a place, and the role that played in explaining why people came back. I'm going to talk some about commercial entrepreneurship and the role that played in helping people come up. But I also want to talk about social entrepreneurship and the role that played. Social entrepreneurship If you think about commercial entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship aimed at seeking profit. Social entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship aimed at social aims rather than profit. And then, if we have time at the end, I want to give some thoughts about post-disaster public policy. Some of that would be relevant for the discussions about what to do in the wake of the hurricane and the earthquake in Haiti a year ago, and the earthquake and tsunami in Japan this year. So why would a political economist be interested in disaster recovery in the first place? The project to understand what was going on in post-disaster recovery in New Orleans began essentially with this observation by John Stuart Mill in his Principles of Political Economy. He wrote, "The perpetual consumption and reproduction of capital affords the explanation of what is so often excited wonder. The great rapidity with which countries recover from a state of devastation, the disappearance in a short time of all traces of mischief done by earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and the ravages of war. An enemy lays waste to a country by fire and sword and destroys or carries away nearly all the movable wealth within it. All the inhabitants are ruined, and yet in a few years after, everything is much as it was before." So what we set out to do was to see how this would occur, if this would occur following Katrina. We wanted to see if New Orleans was a resilient city in the way that this city is supposedly, that the cities that Mill was observing were resilient cities. And there's reasons to believe that it might be, right? That you can think of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. $400 million in their dollars, $10 billion in today's dollars worth of damage. 10 years later, that city's fully recovered. Or you could think about the 1871 Chicago fire, right? $222 million in damage. A third of the population left homeless within 10 years, fully recovered. And so we wanted to see if this would happen following Katrina. The challenge is still Katrina, though, right? So let me tell you a little bit about Katrina, and then I want to give you a report card on where it's going in, where it is now in its recovery efforts, and then explain some about how it got there. So Hurricane Katrina, this is just to remind everybody, about over 1,500 casualties in the greater New Orleans region. That number now in the most recent official estimate is 1,824 people died as a result of Katrina. Over $100 billion in property damage as a result of Hurricane Katrina. Over 55% of the homes in Orleans Parish and the city of New Orleans have the exact same borders, and so you can use them interchangeably. Over 55% of the homes in Orleans Parish had major to severe damage or were destroyed. By major damage, I mean damage greater than $15,000 worth of damage. Hundreds of thousands left homeless, tens of thousands of businesses affected, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. Now those numbers are in some sense relatively small when you think about them in comparison to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, right? That was an earthquake magnitude of 7.0, as much as 316,000 dead as a result of that hurricane, according to some estimates. 1.5 million people left homeless as a result of that. 800,000 of those are still in temporary shelters. Only 700,000 of those have moved to more stable houses. 70% of the population in Haiti today still lack what we call stable employment. So so compared to the New Orleans numbers, those are even more horrific. And then the New Orleans numbers look somewhat small. Or you can think about the recent earthquake and tsunami in Japan, right? Over 10,000 dead as a result of that, so the numbers are greater. But still, that kind of comparison is a strange kind of comparison. We sort of shouldn't, make those kinds of body count style comparisons. And the Katrina disaster was in fact a disaster, and it was something that was really challenging. It was something that they had to struggle. I want to remind you guys of what the damage looked like and what it was that they had to overcome, what the real challenge were, right? So, much of the city underneath floodwaters, the scenes in some of the supposed shelters where individuals were taken in order to weather the storm and then to go in the immediate aftermath. You know, weeks after the storm, this was the kind of damage that they returned to in their communities. Again, and so not surprisingly, in response to this kind of disaster, the recovery's been slow and is still incomplete. That before Katrina, there were 200,000 active households in Orleans Parish. By active household, what I mean is that there's some structure on the property, could be a trailer or what have you, but some structure on a property where they're receiving mail. And so prior to Katrina, there were about 200,000 of these active households in Orleans Parish, in New Orleans. A year after, so remember Katrina hits in August of 2005, a year afterwards, 50% households were active in Katrina. So half the households had still not returned. 2 years after Katrina, 70% active, so about 140,000, 139,000 actually had returned. September 2010, so it's 5 full years after Katrina, 79% active, about 159.4 thousand, 159,400 active households in New Orleans. And by active households, you should keep in mind, like I said, it just means that there's a structure on the property where someone is receiving mail, right? And so doesn't mean that the house is fully repaired, doesn't mean that the house is repaired at all. Doesn't even mean that the house is livable. The house may not, in fact, exist. The person may be living in a trailer, may be living in a temporary structure on the property as they're attempting to build a house. For a long time, there were just trailers on properties when you'd go there. And so this number, in many respects, overstates the recovery, or it underestimates what needed to be done, what needed to be accomplished. And so the recovery's been slow and incomplete, and the recovery's been uneven. That in many ways, New Orleans is still what was called the checkerboard city, right? You drive through some neighborhoods, even, you know, and I spent a lot of time in New Orleans after Katrina hit. You drive through some neighborhoods, even, you know, a year and a half out, the neighborhoods seem fully recovered. If you were to tell me, oh look, there was a devastating hurricane here where most of these houses were damaged and suffered severe damage, I would, you know, it would be like shocking, because the houses the neighborhoods appeared to be doing very well. You drive through some neighborhoods, though, 2 and 3 and even 4 years after Katrina, it looked like they looked when you first visited there immediately following Katrina, right? And so you had some communities that had bounced back to pre-Katrina levels and even greater than pre-Katrina levels, right? People had actually moved into those neighborhoods following Katrina. And you had some communities that were, you know, today still hovering around 60% recovered and even lower. And so that was the challenge that we set out to explain. The central question that we'd asked was, why do people return, and how did they overcome the collective action problem that is post-disaster recovery? So this is I want to just crystallize for you guys what the challenge is of recovering from a disaster like Katrina, right? So the cost of rebuilding are high, right? Just the cost of returning and rebuilding your home are necessarily high. But the benefits are also necessarily uncertain. That part of the benefit you expect to reap when you return to a community and rebuild it is that you're going to be able to rejoin the social networks that existed prior to that happening. We're looking at post-Katrina recovery. It becomes clear that recovery is really a collective action problem, right? So what do I mean by this? So you and I live in a neighborhood, right, that we both liked before Katrina destroyed it. And part of why we like the neighborhood is arguably because we're neighbors, right? And I'm a great neighbor, right? So I bake occasionally, and I deliver baked goods to my neighbors as treats. Very quiet. I'm a scholar, so I spend most of my time writing in silence. Don't have kids, so there's none of that kind of annoyance there. My wife actually enjoys shoveling snow. She thinks of it as a form of exercise. So routinely she'll clear not only our path, but she'll clear our neighbor's path. So we're great neighbors. And so part of the week, if something were to happen in my community, in my neighborhood in Manassas, Virginia, where I live, part of the reason why our neighbors might want to return is because we're actually going to be their neighbors, right? But in an experience like Katrina, where there's that kind of devastation, you don't know if your neighbors are in fact going to return. So you don't know if some of this value that you think you have in being a part of this neighborhood will actually exist if you invest in rebuilding. And so the rational move in that kind of environment, the sensible thing to do is for you to sit on the sidelines and wait to see if my wife and I move back. But the thing is, the rational thing for my wife and I to do is to sit on the sidelines and to wait and see if Steve across the street is coming back. And so the risk of being a first mover in that kind of context could actually be quite prohibitive. Right? The problem is made even worse the more families are involved. The bigger the neighborhood, the bigger the communities, right? And the harder it is for displaced people to communicate, right? So I know Steve is my neighbor, but I don't know Steve's cell phone number. We don't talk on the cell phone. If we were both displaced and I went to live with my mother-in-law and he went to live with his family following a disaster to our community, we wouldn't know how to get in contact with each other to say, okay, so are we both coming back or are we not coming back? Should we be thinking about someplace else to go? And so that problem of the uncertainty around whether or not the community will be like it is when we return, the collective action problem is made even worse. It's a thing that, you know, after Katrina, people reported having a hard time getting in contact with their family members, let alone members of their church or the clubs that they belong to or their neighborhoods, people who lived in their neighborhoods. And it's a problem that you should note is made harder as time passes, right? As I may know, as we were evacuating, Steve may have said, hey, I'm going to my mother-in-law, and I may have said, hey, I'm going to my, you know, my cousins or what have you, but as time passes, where we went is no longer the same, and so that problem of the collective action problem even gets worse the longer recovery takes to get underway. And so we set out to ask these questions. Why is it that people return? Why return to a neighborhood that's been totally devastated, that looked like they looked in the pictures there? Why not just rebuild, go somewhere else and rebuild? It was a question that we had. And then how is it that they overcame this problem that we, you know, identified and that people complained about when we talked about them? And so those were the questions that drove our research. And our approach, because we were asking these questions that have qualitative answers, was we had interview-based qualitative methods. We interviewed 300 people in the affected area, and that number actually is somewhat understated because it depends on how you count the affected area. If you include St. Bernard's Parish, which is right next door to New Orleans, if you include the people we talked to in Houston who had yet to return but were from New Orleans, that number climbs to over 400 people. As it notes there, 103 New Orleans evacuees still live in the Houston area we talked to. These interviews were long-form interviews. Most of them ran about an hour. We spent a lot of time talking to them about what their communities were like before the storm so we could get a sense of what they might be returning to, what they might want to return to. We spent a lot of time talking about what their Katrina experiences were like, some of the horrors that they went through as Katrina hit and as they were surviving that, some of the acts of heroism that we heard about. We spent the bulk of the time talking about how it is that when faced with a house that was, you know, completely devastated, they made the decision to come back and were able to do it. And as I said, our answers ended up focusing on these four things: club goods, sense of place, commercial entrepreneurship, and social entrepreneurship. So I want to tell you about the Mary Queen of Vietnam community. It's a Vietnamese American community in New Orleans East. I have a map here. So in the sort of upper right quadrant of the city, with the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church is the center of this community. But only of the 4,000 people that live within a mile radius of the church, 95% of them belong to the church and are Vietnamese American. So it's a heavily Vietnamese American community. everybody in the community can trace its roots actually to 3 villages in North Vietnam that they evacuated in 1954 when the conflict in Vietnam began. They moved from those 3 villages to the south primarily because they were Roman Catholic, and so were worried about persecution by the North Vietnamese. They moved to the south. In 1975, when Saigon fell, they migrated to the U.S. and moved pretty much into, they moved into an apartment complex. The early movers moved into an apartment complex in this community, and then more came and they built up this community. It's a medium income community. It's the income level that is just below the average for Orleans Parish. But it's also a community that was one of the hardest hit following Katrina. Between as little as 5 and as much as 12 feet of flood waters were in that community. So some of the most severe flooding in the whole of the city. But it was also one of the quickest to return. Right? By April of 2006, so just 6 months, just over 6 months of following Katrina, 30% had returned. By the summer of 2007, so 2 years following Katrina, 90% had returned. And so this was a real puzzle to explain. How is it that this community managed to come back so quickly? And this is at a time when, as they note now, even now, 5.5 years after, some communities are still hovering around 60%. And at the time that this community come back, some of the richer communities were still very low, as little as 10% in some communities. Another thing that made this such a puzzle to explain was that in the months following Katrina, the Urban Land Institute, who was tasked with coming up with a recovery plan for the community, actually said that significant study would have to occur before we would even allow this community to return. So this community was slated to be green space in the period following Katrina. Another thing that, like I said, makes this a puzzle is because the consensus amongst the people who looked at Katrina immediately following it was that the communities that came back quicker, if you talk to anybody in September of 2005, they would say the communities that are coming back the quickest will be the richest communities and the ones that are the most politically connected. This was a community that wasn't one of the richest. Like I said, income levels were medium. They were just below the average for New Orleans, and it was completely insular. Now, they have a Vietnamese American congressman who represents New Orleans, but prior to Katrina, they didn't involve themselves in politics at all. It was, in fact, Katrina that got him interested in politics and made him interested in that. And so this was a puzzle to explain. When talking to people, it quickly became clear that what might explain this, though, is that the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church provided its community with a bundle of club goods that made it easier for displaced residents to coordinate return. So they came up with a mechanism to solve that problem that Steve and I would have of, are you coming back, are you coming back? We're not sure, let's just wait to see if other people came back. So they offered club goods that made it easier to coordinate around return and that increased the benefits of returning or lowered the costs. Let me offer specifically what they did was they created an exclusive New Orleans specific ethnic religious community. Let me offer a few quotes from some of the people that we talked to. Paul says, your identity, your community, your culture, your life, your heritage can all be had here in this place. I think that's what it was we're fighting for, like underneath it all. And Duang says, before Katrina, we Vietnamese people met each other every day. We go to church. On weekends, we go to church. In the morning and in the evening, we get together and dine. We spend the whole day together. On weekdays, I cook and take care of my grandchildren. My children go to work and my grandchildren go to school. I knew it would be difficult to return, but I still wanted to come back. I'm happy here, even though I had to work all day. I like it here. The people in the neighborhood visited each other. It was enjoyable. We shared the food. Now we love each other even more than before the hurricane. and Tran, we came back because we are all Vietnamese. We came back to New Orleans because we're all Vietnamese. This place is like our second homeland, so we have to come back to rebuild this place. And so specifically, how did the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church support this thing? Well, they did it in a number of ways. They hosted Vietnamese American language masses. These were masses that twice daily, actually, in the Mary Queen of Vietnamese Church. The church also served as a meeting space for non-religious and religious groups, and so the members of the community viewed the church as a social space that, not just for their religious activities, but when they went to meet friends is when they interacted in the church. And the church also hosted weekend markets, selling Vietnamese produce, arts, and crafts. And it provided an organizational structure that I'll talk about some later that kept people connected even when they were far-flung, even when they had been evacuated to Houston and Dallas and Atlanta and other places. The point, though, is about all that is that this is a community that's difficult to recreate elsewhere, right? And you don't, unless they were able to get together and to coordinate a move elsewhere, that this was a community that they were likely to not be able to find anywhere else. And you talk about, when we talk to people who, from this community who spent time in Houston, whatever, one of the things that they spoke to was them missing this community. They were able to create a second homeland in New Orleans. That second homeland was missing when they were there. But this is, more importantly than that, though, in terms of the difficulty of creating it elsewhere, it was arguably essential to create it elsewhere, particularly for some of the older members of the community. For instance, the older members of the community many of them didn't speak English. And so they couldn't be independent if not surrounded by Vietnamese businesses, doctors, lawyers, stores, weekend markets, and their friends, right? That you talk to some of the older people in this community who, were evacuated to places where some of their, arguably some of their children lived, and they would say, look, when I was living with my daughter in Houston, I actually felt handicapped. When I was back in New Orleans, I was a respected elder member of my community that could, get around, conduct my own business. I was able to live an independent life. In Houston, I couldn't do that. In Houston, I was dependent on my children. I had to come back. There was no thought in my mind to not come back to this kind of community, because in this kind of community, I'm actually able to be fully myself. So let me tell you about another community. The Ninth Ward. If you've seen either the first or second Spike Lee movie, a bunch of it took place around the Ninth Ward. It's where the levees broke. And so it's arguably the place that got the most press immediately following Katrina. Prior to Katrina, it was a disadvantaged neighborhood. And so they had the problems that you would expect to find in a disadvantaged neighborhood, right? So poverty levels were high, crime was higher than on other places in the city. It was a disadvantaged community. But still, the residents came back to this community, and the residents came back even though they had an opportunity. Some of them had opportunities to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Ninth Ward, as I said before, was also a place that had significant damage, right? And so, just by hinting into where the levees broke, you know that 81% of the homes suffered significant damage. And 2 years after Katrina, recovery levels in the Ninth Ward were very low. So 26% active households 2 years out, as low as 7% in some, depending on how you carved out specific neighborhoods. And so this was a challenge. And so, it may be obvious why, okay, well, the Vietnamese American community, they have to return there because, they have the second homeland that they've managed to create there. This is huge history. And this community was, such a vibrant community prior to Katrina, why not come back? The question, though, is why return to a community like the Ninth Ward? And interestingly, the kinds of stories that they told, the ones who did come back actually told, were very similar to the ones that the people in the Vietnamese American community told. Returning residents believed that their communities possessed a unique set of characteristics that, when taken together, they cannot be found or easily replaced elsewhere. When we talked to people, as much as 84% attributed their decision to return to New Orleans' uniqueness. There's no place like New Orleans was a familiar refrain in those interviews, a phrase that came up again and again. Ed Williams, no, that ain't ever crossed my mind not to come back. This is my home. Why would I leave? This is my home. And Ronald Jones, there's no place like New Orleans. I've been in all kinds of parts of the world. It's just different, the food. And I should stop here to say that the food, New Orleans residents are insane about food. That easily 2 to 3 minutes of every hour-long interview was spent talking about the various kinds of food that you could have. It's a insanity that I don't quite understand, but it's certainly an insanity there. The food, the history, the culture, the architecture, the music. There's no place like New Orleans. And we have the best politicians money can buy. We elect politicians that couldn't get elected as a dog catcher in other states. There's just something about New Orleans that's unique. That, again, these kinds of things were coming. If you saw the Spike Lee's most recent film, his sort of follow-up to When the Levees Break, you had quotes from people from the Ninth Ward community saying, okay, I moved to Texas. I hate Humble, Texas. There's nothing here. Things you can do in New Orleans, they would say over and over, are things that you just can't do in Houston, right? In Houston, if you sit on your porch and you talk to your neighbors, they look at you funny. In New Orleans, they don't do that. We've got to go. There's just something special, something unique about New Orleans. Robert Jackson. New Orleans is a city, again, that is unlike any other city I've been. Everything about it is unique. And just to give you a sense of, this is the level of the kind of food insanity that sort of infects New Orleans. There's food here that you will find no place else in this country, period. We have red beans and rice, hot sausages, pickle pork, gumbo. We have the best seafood in the country, bar none. There's po' boys. I mean, you don't have po' boys anyplace else. Gracious, I mean, shrimp, toffee, crawfish, bisque. You can't get that any place but New Orleans. You just can't. I found out, this is interesting to me, we use pickle pork a lot in seasoning. It goes in beans, it goes in greens, it goes in all kinds of stuff. If it's a seasoning meat, and rather than fresh pork, it's pickle. I found that after the storm that the only place you can buy pickled pork is in New Orleans. And again, just similarly, Martin Davis, the flavor of New Orleans is unlike any other. And I've been to a lot of cities. I've lived in a lot of cities in my lifetime, and everywhere else, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and there's nothing like New Orleans. And arguably the same could be said of any place, but not many places have been so disparaged for having so little redeeming qualities as this community was in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, and yet people still had a sense of place, a sense of why their community was better than other communities, why returning to their community was essential. And so those first two, sense of place and club goods, speak to, arguably the why of Katrina recovery. The next 2 points on commercial entrepreneurship really speak to the how. And so after Katrina, commercial entrepreneurs provided key materials and services that facilitate rebuilding, including the rebuilding of social spaces. I don't know about you, but I don't know how to build a home. So if my home was destroyed, I would need to rely on others to help me build. I need to rely on plumbers, electricians, carpenters, masons, folks who eradicated the mold from the fact that my home was underwater. I'd have to buy new furniture, I'd have to buy new clothes, and for all of that, I'd have to get building materials and other things to, paint, wood, cement, and others. Over and above their everyday roles in providing these kinds of things, commercial entrepreneurs played arguably heroic efforts in the immediate aftermath of Katrina. They also did another thing that was important. They signaled that particular communities were recovering. You're simply not, think about it, you're simply not going to move back to a community where there's no corner store, there's no signs of life. Not only because there's going to be no place to work if none of the entrepreneurs are actually back in business, but it's going to suggest to you that this community maybe isn't a community that's about to come back. And so commercial entrepreneurs played another important role where they signaled that particular communities were coming back. I'm going to talk to you about Casey Kassim, who owned the discount zone in the 9th Ward. Discount zone is almost many things. It's a laundromat, it's a gas station, it's a local grocery store, and it also has a small restaurant inside of it. So it performed in a number of roles. Casey was the owner of that store. I'm focusing on Casey, but I don't want to suggest that large entrepreneurs didn't play an important role. So places like Walmart did a superb job, both in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, where in some stores the managers actually, because they were permitted to do this by the higher-ups, actually just gave away needed stuff to people who needed food stuff and whatever, the people who were suffering. And so commercial entrepreneurs, large and small, did an important role. In months following, places like Walmart and Lowe's and what have you kept shelves stocked for needed supplies for Katrina residents. And so I don't want to, by focusing on Casey, I don't want to suggest that other kinds of commercial enterprises didn't play an important and significant role. I want to talk about Casey. Casey, in many ways, it's hard to talk about because Casey's one of the people I interviewed without just thinking about him as a hero, right? So he decided that he would ride out the storm in his store in the 9th Ward. It was a 2-story building, and so he figured he would be safe in the top story where, in addition to the gas station, laundromat, food, local grocery store, and local restaurant, he also had a few apartments. So anyway, so he decided he'd ride it out at the top of his store in the few apartments. He had the presence of mind, though, to go and get his boat and to tie it up to the building, because he thought there'd be flooding, but he didn't think it would be the kind of flooding that existed, but he thought there might be some flooding. He thought a boat may come in handy. And so he did that, and the hurricane passed. There was the calm that everybody reported immediately after the hurricane, where the hurricane passed, and people went, this wasn't so bad, some stuff's torn up by wind and what have you, but it looks like we're okay. And then the water comes rolling in, and there's flooding at levels that they had not anticipated. And so his boat that he tied up, is there. As the flooding seems to settle, he starts hearing screams and sounds from some of his neighbors. And he's finding people trapped on their roofs. And so he goes out at a time when, again, it's still very dangerous. And there's not just, floodwaters, but there's all sorts of debris and other stuff in the water. He goes out and starts rescuing people from their roofs around the neighborhood immediately surrounding his store, and brings them back to his second story, and then manages to get them all to a bridge where they're then evacuated by officials. And so so in many ways he's a hero. Just had he done nothing else but that, he'd be in my book a hero and somebody we should revere. But the other thing he did, though, was that he decided, even at a time when the 9th Ward was a ghost town, as the quote I said before is still as few as 26% 2 years after Katrina. So 9th Ward's a ghost town. He decides, I'm going to open up my store as soon as possible, because there's no way people are coming back unless they have jobs, unless they have they can get gas for their cars, they can buy stuff in their local communities, and so he does that. And so his within months of Katrina, he reopens his gas station. And that the thing that he had not anticipated, which also turned out to be the case, was that his store was before Katrina, and he knew it to be important, but didn't realize how important was a social space. It was a space where when people came in to shop for stuff, they actually chatted and talked and what have you. And so it became a place of normalcy as they returned to their homes that were completely devastated and had to gut their houses or try to rebuild. It became a place, by getting his store back and running, by getting it open, and it became a place where they could reconnect socially, and a place of normalcy at a time when nothing in New Orleans was that normal. And so commercial entrepreneurs, the big ones like the Walmarts, and the little ones like the smaller ones like the Casey Kassims, played an important role in bringing back, helping communities to recover following Katrina. After Katrina, those social entrepreneurs also played an important role. Arguably the biggest is they helped to solve that collective action problem associated with deciding to return and rebuild by doing a number of things: collecting info on evacuees and their intentions to come back, acting in many cases as first movers. Dorothy Voitere, who was the superintendent of St. Bernard Parish, was an amazing social entrepreneur in the face of Katrina. She said 2 months after Katrina, "Look, I will have a place for everyone in my school who registers by November 1st. She expected 50. One of the reasons why, when you talk to people about why they weren't returning, it was because, well, if I return, there's no place to put my kid in school. I can't really return if I have kids. She expected 50 to 703 registered. By April of the next year, so 8 months after Katrina, 2,000 had registered. So in addition to sort of helping to solve this collective action problem by acting as a first move, acting as a focal point for people, social entrepreneurs also organized and engaged in outreach activism and advocacy on behalf of their communities. They kept members involved and informed about the political developments following Katrina. They lobbied in many cases. As I noted earlier, some communities in the initial plans following Katrina said that they might not be allowed to return, and so it was really important for members of those communities to lobby and to convince the planners that theirs was the community that should be allowed to come back. And then many directly assisted in the rebuilding efforts and provided essential services, like gutting buildings and houses, providing all sorts of aid. I can tell you about a couple of them. Father Vienne, who's the pastor of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church that I talked about earlier, played an amazing role. In the days, within days following Katrina, Father Vienne also, in many ways, a hero and someone who actually saved lives in a vein similar to Casey Kassim. He decided that he recommended that everybody in his community evacuate. Some of the older members of the community said, "We're not evacuating. Hurricanes happen in New Orleans. We're going to ride out this hurricane too." So he convinces them to ride it out in the Mary Queen of Vietnam schoolhouse, which is a 2-story structure. So he does that. Again, same sort of thing happens. The hurricane passes, there's this calm, people start returning to their homes because it appears that the worst is past. Floodwaters start rushing in. He and members of the Mary Queen of Vietnam leadership who had stayed with him start going throughout the whole community on boats and retrieving people who had returned to their homes and were now trapped as a result of the floodwaters. And gets them back to the church, and they ride it out until they're able to get help from outside. As soon as he was able, though, so after doing this, as soon as he was able, he started visiting the evacuation sites in Louisiana, Texas, Georgia, and Arkansas. And he was on the road. And what he did a couple of things when he went to those sites. One thing he did was he took pictures of everybody he visited, because he knew that when he went to sites where others were, they'd be concerned about their family and friends, and he wanted to convince them that they were all right. So he took pictures of everybody he spent time with, which was an amazing presence of mind to do that. He also told them all that they were returning. He said, yeah, I talked to, I've just come from the evacuation site in Baton Rouge, and they all say that they're coming back. They hadn't, but he told them that they had, and then he went to Houston, and after he left Houston, he went to Atlanta and said, hey, I just talked to the people in Houston, and they all say that they're coming back. And so he immediately focused the attention on return rather than anything else. He also had in his mind that recognizing the important role that the church played in the community, he had a, if you build it, they will come kind of mentality. So he said, look, the first thing we're going to do is rebuild the church. We'll rebuild the church, we'll repair it, we'll rebuild the schoolhouse. It'll serve as, the church will, work to deal with their spiritual needs, but the schoolhouse will be a place where they could get aid if they needed, they could stay if they needed to. It could be a place for focusing that. And so he did that. Within 6 weeks after the storm, he began holding services in the church. This, again, I can't stress enough, 6 weeks after Katrina, early October, New Orleans is a ghost town. Some communities haven't even been allowed to come back yet. So at this time, people, if you lived in the 9th Ward, you weren't even allowed to return to your property at this time. And he's beginning to hold services. He gets 300 people to show up to his first service. Holds a service the next week, gets 800 people to show up. The third service, he has 2,000 people show up. And what he did was he, again, not only he took pictures of these services, and then he used them to encourage those who hadn't yet returned. He could continue to visit people in evacuation sites. He used those pictures to encourage, well, look, the church is almost full. What do you mean by you're not coming back after Katrina? So he used that to convince people to come back. But he also used it to shame public officials. Because at the time, public officials were saying, well, look, things like garbage disposal and other public service, water, other public services, the challenge is trying to figure out, they're now in short supply. We've got to really be judicious about where we allow, which communities we allow these to go to, right? And so we know we're going to take care of the French Quarter because that's where the tourists come, and so of course they'll get. But when we decide how to, whether or not to provide all sorts of public services, including police protection, we've got to make smart choices now. We're not in that time. And your community had so much devastation, there's no way that it's going to come back. And so what he did was he, again, took pictures of the church services and used them to shame the public officials. Look, I got a church full of people here now, not theoretically here, not maybe going to be here. They're actually here. Look, there are pictures of them. And here's a list of all their names, right? And they all committed that if they come back and there's electricity, they'll pay for electricity. And he also threatened, again, with those pictures and the leverage of a community that was already showing signs of recovery, he also threatened to build a tent city if the mayor didn't sign off on all this stuff, right? And so he said, look, we want a FEMA park for our older citizens. We want to have them all in one place. We don't want them spread out over the community. We want the FEMA park in the property that we have across from the church. If you don't if you don't sign up, they needed his signature to approve such a thing, even though the funds are being provided by the federal government. If you don't approve it, we'll build a tent city, and then you'll have to explain why in the city that you call, by the way, a chocolate city, in the immediate aftermath, the Vietnamese American who are back are living in tents when the FEMA trail is available that aren't being provided. So he used that to that, and he also used the church, like I said, as a staging area to provide, which was ethnically appropriate aid, right? So figuring out their, at this time, programs which, you have to apply to get aid. They have a community full of people who, many of whom speak, certainly all the older people only speak Vietnamese. So using the church as a place where they, could work with those people to figure it out and to do the translations and what have you also became important. And so Father Bien did a key role. I'll tell you a little bit about Latoya Cantrell and what she did with she's the president of the Broadmoor Improvement Association in the town of Broadmoor, and her role in organization and activism. Broadmoor is a community. It's a middle-class community, essentially. It's near Central City in New Orleans. Do I have okay, near Central City. It's also a diverse community, so it's not large populations of whites, blacks, whites and blacks. The Broadmoor, Latoya Cantrell and the Broadmoor Improvement Association did a number of things to facilitate recovery. One, it used email to mobilize and inform its members, right? It made sure that the members were kept abreast of what was going on in New Orleans, even when they were far from. The BIA was an organization that had existed prior to Katrina. It was, it's sort of one of those neighborhood improvement associations there where everybody belongs to, but meetings aren't, hugely attended because it's, they're talking about cleaning particular streets and stuff like that. So it's not a really active community, but it's a community that happened to have a very good email list of all of its members following prior to Katrina, and so it was able to use those lists to keep its residents, neighborhood residents, abreast of what was going on. It also lobbied to resist the green dot. So again, following Katrina, the city decided that what it needed, a disaster this big, of this scale, what we need is a comprehensive redevelopment plan. We need to get everybody in a room, and we need to decide how it is that we're all gonna, what the plan for the city is. And with this, they enlisted the Urban Land Institute as a consultant to come up with a draft of this plan. And when the draft was finished, and towards the latter part of 2005, what you had was certain communities designated as, like I said before, green space. So some communities were just not going to be permitted to come back. They'd actually, if you looked at the map of the initial plan, there were actually green dots on places where there were like homes and people living. And so you had Broadmoor was one of those communities that was signaled to be green space. They thought it would be a good idea to have Broadmoor as green space. And to treat it, because much of New Orleans is, again, below sea level, as a catchment area for floodwaters, is what Broadmoor would be designated as in the immediate aftermath. And so using this, using these email lists and series of meetings and what have you, the Latoya Cantrell and the BIA effectively lobbied and were able to resist it, so that subsequent plans didn't include that. And what they did in order to preempt it for future rounds of planning was that they developed their own revitalization plan for their neighborhood. And as a result of these efforts, both the mobilizing and the Broadmoor is Coming Back program that they had, where they actively sort of, there were signs everywhere, Broadmoor is coming back, Broadmoor is redeveloping, and their effective lobbying efforts, they were able to have as much as 66% of the houses in livable or under repair within 2 years of Katrina. And now those numbers are close to pre-Katrina levels. And then social entrepreneurs, like many of the commercial entrepreneurs, provided essential services throughout the recovery period, right? So Katrina Crew is an organization who helped with cleanup. They helped with gutting houses and taking away the debris. They had 25,000 volunteers from around the country work through Katrina Crew, and so they organized crews of volunteers from elsewhere, and they ended up clearing 250,000 tons of debris. Habitat for Humanity, who you may have heard about, and other agencies, the Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt style efforts that actually help with rebuilding and actually work to provide housing. And then Project Kid, started by a very interesting social entrepreneur who said, look, people are rebuilding these homes that have been underwater in some cases for multiple weeks. They can't have their children in here. What we're going to do is provide emergency-free childcare. Bring your child in, you don't have to pay, you don't have to worry about that. Your children will be protected. You can go and go about the business of rebuilding homes. And others provided food, clothes, shelter, and what have you. And so let me just take a couple of minutes and offer some thoughts on post-disaster public policy. And again, like I said, some of these may be relevant for what's been going on in Haiti and what's now going on in Japan. We learned a couple of lessons doing this project, I think, that are useful for policymakers. One is that neighborhoods are built and rebuilt by residents and business owners, not by governments. Governments play a role. I'm not trying to say governments don't play a role, right? Getting basic municipal services back online is a critical role that needs to happen if a community is going to develop, right? And so, if, people had expectations around the government picking up garbage, providing police, and the like, and it's important that they do that if the community is going to recover. And same with opening schools and having a place for their kids to go and to learn is essential if communities are going to come back. But the work of rebuilding is work that's done by individuals and by business owners. What happens, another sort of lesson that comes out of this is that the moment following a disaster is not the time to re-engineer an entire city, right? So Katrina happens, and immediately many public officials and some outsiders decided this is an opportunity to change the footprint of New Orleans. We didn't like it how it was before. Much of it's been destroyed or damaged. What we can do now is we can actually develop a plan that will change the way New Orleans looks. Right? And what happens when they go and develop this plan? New Orleans had 5 comprehensive plans in the 5 years following Katrina. So 5 separate ones with different, often conflicting policies and different and conflicting notions about which communities would be allowed to recover, what kind of support they would get in their recovery efforts, what other services the governments at various levels would help them provide. They had 5 of these to contend with. All the while, the planning's going on, rebuilding's not happening, right? And so, talked some earlier about the uncertainty that exists in the face of a disaster like Katrina already, right? That exists without any extra things going on. So now imagine, in addition to all that uncertainty, will my neighborhood really be like it was before? And so is it worthwhile me coming back first, or should I wait? If I do come back, is the place where I worked going to be there? Will I still have a job? All that uncertainty is going on. In addition to that, the government seems to be saying that, in this initial proposal, that they won't give me a permit to actually rebuild if I were to return. Okay, so I'm going to maybe stay in Houston a little bit longer rather than come back and return, because it doesn't look like my community's going to be allowed to come back. That the last report said that it might, but this report said that it might not. Again, that's to the level of uncertainty and confusion about what in fact it is that the right thing for me to do in that circumstance where I've been displaced by a disaster is. And so, the moment following the disaster isn't the time to redesign the city. It's the time to do what can be done to facilitate recovery and essentially get out of the way. The third lesson that we learned is that when it comes to official disaster response and assistance, stick to the basics, but deliver it swiftly. Right? It's much more important that the community commit, the local governments commit to providing sewage and garbage and water to a community than it is that they commit to providing a light rail from the main part of the city to it, right? That's It's much more important that they say they're going to deliver the basics and actually deliver the basics on time. It's much more important that they go, look, the schools that were open before will be open. There will be a place for your kid to go to school, than it is for them to engage in comprehensive planning about whether or not there's in fact enough green space in New Orleans and whether or not this is an opportunity to deliver green space. If for no other reason, based on the results of Katrina recovery, we don't know. The planners seem to be very bad and arguably likely to be very bad at predicting which communities are going to actually come back and which communities aren't going to come back. They did a horrible job of predicting winners and losers. They said that Broadmoor and New Orleans East community, Vietnamese American community, won't even be permitted to return because the devastation is so bad. They were amongst the first to come back. So comprehensive plans of the sort that make these decisions about which communities are going to win and which communities are going to lose are just likely to be certainly proven fallible in the case of Katrina recovery, and are likely to be fallible. And again, so all these sort of speak to, how important it is that public officials anchor community expectations around achievable positive outcomes. Public policy can help to anchor community expectations around the likelihood of a successful rebound, not by promising the world, as I said before, but by just getting the lights turned on and the water restored. By promising only what is absolutely necessarily achievable, policy makers create a space where civil society individuals can step in. And so thank you much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks for coming. Did many of the people you interviewed express concerns about the fact that the city is still under water level and it could happen again? And also, to go to the public policy point, they need to the government needs to turn the water and the electricity on and everything, but then they also need to instill some sort of confidence in the people that the levees are going to be rebuilt and be rebuilt better, and that takes time. So maybe that's why recovery is slower there?
Yeah, so it's certainly the case that the communities, if you look at the neighborhoods that are right where the levees broke, that those in the weeks following Katrina, so after the floodwaters were subsided, they were, looked like a bomb went off, right? Those houses were just uninhabitable and didn't look like it. If you returned a couple of years later, those houses had been taken down and they were just sort of flat, sort of with grass growing over in the properties. It's unclear if the people from those communities will ever believe or trust that the levees won't in fact break again and they won't face the kind of devastation that they faced following Katrina. So you're certainly right. The one thing that government ought to do, or arguably ought to do, is to at least be clear about what in fact they're committing to when they say we have a levee system and it can withstand acts. One of the things that was unfortunate, really unfortunate about the whole Katrina experience is that the government had committed to, look, we have levees and they can withstand X, hurricanes at X levels. We're so confident in that we're going to draw the flood maps, assuming that the levees will never break and there will never be a reason to have flood insurance in certain areas. And so they have that as the, and so that was sort of one of the things that they did in response. That meant that people who suffered tremendous flooding following Katrina had actually been told that they didn't need to get flood insurance because they were not in danger of facing floods, right? And so it's unclear if the agencies responsible for building the levees and for constructing the flood maps were honest about, in fact, the dangers that face those communities if those communities would have existed there in the first place. It may be the case that they might not have been able to get homeowners insurance because with accurate flood maps that didn't say you're in no danger of being flooded, when in reality they were in danger of 12 feet worth of floodwaters, they may not have ever moved there. And so, I think that it comes back to one of the last points what I was making, which is that I'd said that what government ought to do is make clear promises and keep those promises. And so stick to the basics of what it's meant to do. And if it did that, that arguably recovery would have been faster in the wake of New Orleans. This just, this discussion of the levees sticks to maybe that should be the policy at all times. Stick to the make clear promises, stick to the basics, deliver exactly what was promised. Efforts to have agencies in place that don't do accurate assessments of the actual danger of flooding, and so that people don't end up with flood insurance, so that then they're not able to recover swiftly because they never got, one, they were in a neighborhood that they might not have been in otherwise because they might not have been able to get flood insurance. Two, because they were in that neighborhood, they don't now have flood insurance at the levels that they ought to have it, and so then they're not able to recover swiftly because they don't have insurance at the appropriate levels. That's arguably a way where the agencies responsible made recovery, made the level of devastation worse than it otherwise would have been, and made recovery slower than it might otherwise have been. So. Other questions?
To a statement. I mean, I'm from the Maronite of New Orleans.
Okay.
All right, so it's the French Quarter of Maronite.
Yeah.
I can see the river every morning. We know that we live 6 feet below sea level. We understand that our levees might not hold. What we were expecting at Katrina was a little more response, a better response to the people, a response to my neighborhood, where it didn't even get hit. All right, because the pumps, like they say, the French Quarter.
Right.
And but the response time was really bad. That's all it is, So we know we live in the bayou. That's where we live at.
Right.
And we like it there.
Yeah, no, it's not, as I was talking about earlier, the people we talk to from New Orleans love New Orleans and want to make a go of it in New Orleans and what have you. The problem, to the extent that there's a problem, is that there's certain expectations that have developed there over time about what they might expect, not from government at various levels, that have turned out to be expectations that didn't bear out, right? And so they were told in some communities that, look, the Superdome is a viable site to weather things like Hurricane Katrina. It turned out that it wasn't really a viable site. It turned out it was an horrific place to weather something like a Katrina, right? And so the choice about where to live and how much, and whether or not it made sense to stay there is a choice that was informed by this notion that, look, we think what we have is a good evacuation site that we can get to very easily, that turns out to not be a place that you really want to weather a storm. It turns out to be a place where that ended up being very dangerous to weather a storm. So.
To what degree do you think the overall economy in the U.S. as a whole has affected or has stifled investment?
So it's hard to sort out with New Orleans because New Orleans, even if you talk to the entrepreneurs who were there and so had chosen to invest there, they didn't have positive things to say about the business climate there, right? They would describe it, the quote earlier about we have, politicians that couldn't get elected, dog catcher. It sort of speaks to the levels of corruption and how important it was to know someone who knew somebody if you were going to get the requisite permits and what have you. That following Katrina, a frequent complaint was, my store is completely rebuilt. It's ready to go. I can't get the inspectors to come to sign off so I can get electricity from the electrical company, right? Because I don't have the requisite connections to get them to jump me to whatever point in the line I need to be jumped to in order to get that. And so it's hard to tell whether or not people not investing in New Orleans has to do with, look, there was this disaster, we're like nervous about what might happen again, we're not sure, and how much of it had to do with there's a business climate there that even before Katrina had issues and it wasn't exactly an attractive place to invest. Other questions? Well, thank you very much.